Good evening. I'm Amber Payne, co-editor-in-chief of The Emancipator, which is a multimedia publication created to reimagine the first abolitionist newspapers in the United States and reframe the conversation around race and equity and justice. And in partnership with GLAAD and Banned Books Week, we're here to have a really important conversation tonight with some incredible, inspiring authors. I'm really pleased to be introducing George M. Johnson for this panel to host our panel, Claiming Our Stories, LGBTQ Banned Books in America. We know that these books by, for, and about queer authors are currently some of the most targeted, and we really are honored that George would join us tonight to host this conversation. So George M. Johnson is an award-winning Black non-binary writer, author, and activist. He's written for major outlets from Teen Vogue to NBC, BuzzFeed, The Root, The Griot, Essence. I've had the privilege of working with George on a couple of projects myself. They were listed on the Root 100 Most Influential African Americans in 2020 and the Out 100 Most Influential LGBTQ People in 2021. And many of us also know very well that they are the author of the New York Times bestselling young adult memoir, All Boys Aren't Blue, which is about their adolescence growing up as a young Black queer boy in New Jersey, told through a series of powerful essays. And the book was optioned for television by Gabrielle Union and Sony TV. And their second memoir, We Are Not Broken, was released in September 2021. So, George, I turn the panel over to you. And thank you so much. And thank you to our partners, GLAAD, and to the Banned Books Week organization also for their partnership on this. Take it away, George.
Thank you, Amber. Hello, everyone. Once again, I am George M. Johnson, the author of the New York Times bestselling All Boys Aren't Blue. I am so grateful to be here this evening as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of Banned Books Week, which I am also chairing this year. I have the pleasure of now introducing Sarah Kate Ellis, who is the president and CEO of GLAAD, and the co-author of All Moms, as well as ×2, Two Women in Love, and the Happy Family They Made. Welcome, Sarah Kate Ellis, everyone.
Hi. Hi, George. How are you?
I'm good. I'm exhausted. I never thought that we would be in a place where people are burning our books and trying to remove the existence of our story and our narratives, but here we are. But I'm excited that you're here, that we get to talk this evening because you have been a warrior in the trenches for many, many years. And as an author yourself, are also a part of this movement that is trying to make sure that there are books that we can access and that people have when they need some guidance. So if you could just give us a little bit of information about what made you decide to write these books.
Sure. Well, it's so good to see you. One of the things that was, I think, left off of your credentials was that you're a GLAAD Media Award winner. I don't know if I heard that.
I am a GLAAD Media Award winner as well. Yes.
So thank you for all your work. I think, so the first book I did, my wife and I did together. We actually got pregnant at the exact same time. And if lesbians can, it was accidental. It wasn't the plan, but we were both trying because we wanted to start a family. And it was taking longer than we had anticipated. And I was at that moment in time in a publishing career in magazines and very private person, and decided to do that book because I felt like it could actually introduce other people to LGBTQ families and how we create our families, how we love our families. And I thought it was really important, especially at that moment in time for me, because I was bringing children into this world. And so that kind of continued. And then I ended up at GLAAD, which is a whole other thing, right? Like fighting mostly for, because I want a better world for my children, and all the children both in our community and who are adjacent to our community or included in our community because they're born into our community. But when my wife and I, when the kids were little, we realized that there were no books that showed our family. There was actually not really any television programming or anything of that nature. And so luckily being at GLAAD, I was able to influence and impact that. And so we created a partnership with Little Bee Books to produce children's books. We also started an advisory council with a lot of Hollywood creators who were creating young adult material and family material, like shows on Disney and stuff like that, to be more inclusive in their storytelling. And I have to say, we've seen over the past several years that there has been an intense amount of more LGBTQ inclusion in family TV programming, and we're seeing it more and more in books. And I do think that's part of the backlash, that what we're seeing is a bit of backlash. I do think there's a much bigger issue happening here, and we'll get to that. But essentially, I wrote the book. My wife and I actually co-authored it, the book that we wanted our kids to have when they were little. And so that other families like us could have something. And also, I think, I think mom is such a gendered term, and I don't think it needs to be a gendered term. I think it's about how we love unconditionally. And so I think for those two reasons, we felt like it was a really good time to do a book that we wanted to see, that our family didn't see when we were a young family.
Yeah, and you actually brought up a really, really good point, right? It's like we've entered this space where we've had a show like Pose, and we have shows like Legendary, which have, showcased one side of the ballroom community. And now we have, I'm going to forget the name, but Billy Eichner has this new movie coming out, which is going to be on Netflix, and right. And everybody, bros, and people are really, really excited about it, and it has a lot of the queer community all within the casting. And so over the years, we have seen this expansion of queer media in a variety of ways, whether it be publishing or television. But on the other side of that, we have seen that the larger our media has become, the more visible we are becoming, the more we are being attacked, and the more laws are coming out against us, whether it's the Don't Say Gay or transgender bills. What is your bird's eye view of where the book bans fit into, this larger movement against LGBTQ youth?
So I think the book bans are a tactic within a much larger anti-LGBTQ movement that we're seeing gain speed, traction, and is well financed, quite frankly. And just to put it into perspective for folks, there were over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed this year. So that's from January. That's the largest we've seen in a decade, or more, actually. And so most of those bills were targeted at our youth, they were anti-LGBTQ youth, specifically mostly trans and gender nonconforming youth. But definitely there are book bans in there. There's a lot in there. And I think, I've thought a lot about this, like, why go after youth? And I think a big part of it is their strategy is that these folks don't have a big voice in this society yet because they're young. They can't vote. They don't have, a lot of them don't have social media channels yet. They're young. And they don't have any economic power and vocal power. And so I think they're targeted, and we need to stand up for them in that space. I think the book bans are a piece of that. And we've seen this before, right? Like, we've seen an uptick in anti-LGBTQ book bans, even though there weren't that many to ban. There's a lot more to ban now, thank goodness. which is a show of progress. I do. I want some joy and light in here because we've made a tremendous amount of progress. Yet we have a lot, far to go. And I think a lot in our community has been overlooked. A lot of people in our community have been overlooked. But it is one piece of a larger coordinated attack. Even if you look at these bills and you line them up, they have the same language. So it's a plug and play playbook that anti-LGBTQ activists have.
Yeah, it's funny, we were just talking about this yesterday on a different call I was on, and it was like the bills literally use the exact same language from state to state, which coincides with the way that the book ban started, because they're using the exact same quotes from each and every book, state to state. And so, like you said, it is like a well-oiled machine that has been built against us. And I think that'll lead to the final question is, we see what their machine is in many ways. What do you think our machine needs to become? It's like we have organizations like GLAAD, and we have like PFLAG, and we have, usually the ACLU and certain places that kind of step up, but it's like, what does our coalition or movement need to look like against this moving forward? Because theirs is very coordinated. Ours is a little bit reactive, even though we've been winning a lot, and the youth have reacted to this in a way that has been very powerful and very transformative. But what does it look like maybe for us to even be more proactive as organizations and as movement leaders?
I would say, I think you nailed it, which is we've been very reactive. And each year we're kind of clutching our pearls saying, oh my gosh, now we have more bills. We know the legislative session is going to start in January. We know that they're going to flood us with anti-LGBTQ bills, and we need to get ahead of that as best as possible. One of the challenges is that I think one of the great pieces I want to say here is that there've never been more out LGBTQ youth than ever before. There's never been more need for this content. They've never been louder and prouder. And so I do think it's a double-edged sword, which is where you started with, right, George, which is more visibility can lead to more backlash. But this is a bump in the road. It is not a pretty bump. It's an ugly bump, and it's painful and harmful, and there are people's lives in the crosshairs. It is, though, we will come out the other side of this because we are winning people. We win the sentiment, we win public opinion, and we are lifting each other up in our community. But I do think you're right. I think we need more of an offense than a defense. I mean, we need a defense, but we need more of an offense than a defense, especially around this well-oiled machine. And I will say they do look well-oiled because they fall in line fast. They try things and then they see what sticks and what doesn't. And if they get something that sticks, they fall in line behind it. We need to do better at that as well.
100% agree. You brought up something about the change of demographics, and I know that that's actually going to be part of the rest of the conversation. So I think that's actually a great time to bring in the rest of the panel. So we have some other great authors who are joining us today. We have Isabel Galupo. Please don't let me mess up too many names. It's been a long day. She, her pronouns, the co-author of Maiden and Princess. We have Daniel Haack, he, him pronouns, author of Prince and Knight, Tale of the Shadow King, and co-author of Maiden and Princess. We have my dear friend Leah Johnson, she, her pronouns, author of You Should See Me in a Crown. I'm like, you should see me in a sun. I'm reading both her books together, y'all. It's been a long day. You Should See Me in a Crown and Rise to the Sun. And we also have Harry Woodgate, they, them pronouns, author and illustrator of numerous children's books, including Grandad's Camper and Timid. I want to welcome you all to the panel. How is everyone doing today? Okay, we got good head nods. So let's just get into it. what motivated you, or I'll start. No, I think we're all on camera now because we all gonna answer these questions. So, everyone, please remember to turn your mics on. And I want to start by saying the Toni Morrison quote: "If there's a book that you want to read and hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." It is the quote that I live my life by. It is the reason, and many reasons, that I continue to write books that I wish I had, and uncovering new truths for our youth. So I would like to get started by asking you all, what motivated you to write your books? Anyone can start with this one.
I'll dive right in. I'll dive right on in.
I
So
knew it.
one thing about me, I'm gonna answer some questions. Okay. I think a buzz phrase that comes up a lot for queer authors, authors of color, neurodivergent writers, the list goes on, is, I wrote the book I needed when I was 15, when I was 16. And of course, that is true. The reality is, I wrote the book that I really needed to read when I was 22 and trying to navigate my queerness for the first time. Because I think, in addition to fiction giving us, an expansive world and universe to exist in and lose ourselves in, it also provides us a blueprint for a possible future, right? And so when I was 22, 23, I had just left Indiana for the first time, and most of y'all know it's not an incredibly progressive state. So it wasn't the place where I was really gonna just blossom into the queer, gay auntie energy I'm in now. But I needed to leave home in order to do that. And when I did, I needed something to provide me a blueprint for a possible future. And so I wrote that. My book was a lot of wish fulfillment. I was like, if I can will this into existence on the page, then maybe I can will this into existence in my lived experience as well. And if nothing else, then I'll get paid a couple of dollars and be able to pay my rent, for a couple of months, maybe. And somehow they let me keep on doing it. And so every book in its own way is a way of extending that imagination, is a way of me thinking differently about what my life could look like, not just 16-year-old me, but me now.
Yeah, Daniel, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Leah is saying. I think that's the most constant refrain, writing a children's picture book that features LGBTQ people and relationships, is that I hear, how much people have wished they had that when they were a kid. And I definitely feel that. And I think, Sarah Kate kind of alluded to this before, but, for me growing up, there was very, very little queer LGBTQ plus representation in media, like, at all. And one, I definitely, I think we all owe a ton to GLAAD for just all of their work over the decades in changing that. But, for me, it was really about what kind of representation I wanted to see. Like, even when there was representation, it was very much a secondary character. There's the bury or kill your gays kind of trope that we've seen quite a bit. So for me, it was really important to, center the story around, a gay couple, a gay relationship. And I say this a lot in interviews, but I definitely, for me, I wanted to show kids that gay, queer people are just as capable of being the hero and as worthy of finding love. And so I was really excited to kind of flip this sort of, the typical fairy tales that we had all grown up with, and make them more inclusive and exciting, so that, a kid who, maybe thinking about their identity for the first time can see themselves reflected, a kid who can see their family reflected, or just a kid to understand and think about how there are different relationships and different ways of being in the world.
Isabel?
Yeah, I'll jump in because I think I have a little bit of a different background growing up. I'm second generation queer. I was raised by two queer parents and was just really lucky to have them as role models in my life in general as parents, but also, just being in a household with queer parents. My moms did everything that they could to find any queer media in any way. So, like my shelves were full of books that were written by queer authors, and zines that their friends made. We had I had a lot of access to that growing up. So I do think I was really lucky in that sense, because I knew from a very early age that a queer family was my normal, and queer adults in loving relationships, with successful jobs who were happy and full of joy. That was my norm. And so, in growing up, we had, Heather Has Two Mommies was a big one in my household, Leslie and Newman. And so, as I grew up and became a writer, I knew that I really wanted to just really give back to that community that had raised me, and continue on in this tradition that I was so fortunate to kind of be a part of because of my moms and all the queer people that had come before me. And something I'm really proud of, about, I agree with everything that Leah and Daniel are saying of just, centering the queer characters in the narrative, and also, the letting imagination, everything they're saying was great. But something I'm really proud of about Maiden and Princess is that, fairy tales specifically are used a lot in schools and libraries to kind of teach just fundamentals of storytelling. And I really love the idea of a lesbian fairy tale love story being something that can be used in classrooms, in libraries, in the home, to teach kids about the hero's journey and about tropes and about these things that, fairy tales usually service and bring that knowledge, but it's usually about straight couples. So that's just another, in addition to wanting to really make sure that queer characters are the focus of these epic and joyful love stories, also just kind of normalizing queer characters in a curriculum in that way too.
Awesome. And Harry?
Yeah, I think I pretty much echo what everybody else has said. With Grandad's camp especially, there was sort of an element of wanting to honor previous generations of queer elders, who there sort of felt like there was a gap in literature, in children's literature, where we kind of didn't get to hear multiple generation stories, and now we're at a point where the market, where the community sort of more widely is kind of ready for that. And there was one thing that Leah said that really sort of resonated with me, which was this idea of a blueprint for a better, sort of more positive future. And I think especially with early years, like picture books, even like chapter books, that's a really important thing. Like this idea of creating something which is optimistic, and in which we as authors and illustrators and book makers in general, or content media creators, have kind of left our baggage at the door and kind of imagined this, I don't want to say utopia because it's not, but there's more positive future where things can get better, where that possibility is there. I kind of feel like that's really important for kids growing up now, and for families.
Yeah, I think all of what you said is exactly it. I think a lot of times we probably write for the children that we once were. We probably are still writing from that place of what if we were still those children, what we would say. I think the beautiful thing, and everybody is echoing, I say it all the time to be shady, but I'm like, well, I wrote a book where I didn't die. I wrote a memoir where I didn't die at the end. because we typically know that our characters don't make it to the end and rarely have like a hopeful outcome. But, you know, I think with all of the work that we're doing, or, you know, we're trying to do and that they're trying to suppress, that's part of the story, is that it gives a generation of children who normally don't have hopeful outcomes, and it gives them one of my favorite terms, a possibility model to follow, because we become the possibility models for all of them, not just through our work, but just through our actions and through how we live our public lives. But I also now want to kind of shift a little bit to something that Sarah Kate brought up a little earlier, which was the whole fact of, one, we have a lot more visibility as queer people. We have more representation. Anytime I bring up visibility and representation, I'm always going to say that is just the starting point. It is not our ending point. A lot of people think that our being more visible and being more represented is like, see, you made it. And it's like, no, we're just starting. So I just want to make that clear. But there was a census that came out in 2019, which basically stated that in the United States, Generation Z was 50.2% white and 49.8% non-white. Another large statistic in that census was the fact that 15%, which is probably estimated between 15 and 25% of Generation Z already identifies as LGBTQ. We can't separate, you know, that this change in demographics is the cause and the catalyst of a lot of what is going on. So I just want you all's take of, how is this shift in the demographics, and this quick shift that is actually happening within the demographics, how does that correlate to what we are seeing with the books that they are trying to ban?
I can start. You know, one thing that is super exciting for me is just that, you know, my book, Prince and Knight, was the first title as part of the Little B Books and GLAAD partnership that Sarah Kate referenced earlier. And, you know, at the time when it came out only a few years ago, it was still one of the few LGBTQ plus themed picture books on the market. And what's really exciting to me is the fact that now there are so many more stories being told. You know, we can all tell stories from our narrow experience, but you know, that's kind of there's a lot of onus on, you know, underrepresented communities in terms of the few media references or representation that we do get has to, you know, represent everyone in the community, which will never be done. I think the other thing that, you know, one piece that I just noticed was, you know, my book came out in 2018, and there were a few, you know, small challenge attempts, censorship attempts, but it wasn't until the following year when we started to see, you know, more representation in kids media overall, that the attacks started becoming much bigger, more frequent, and more serious. So, you know, it definitely is, as Sarah Kate said, a double-edged sword, where we're getting a lot more of this representation, but at the same time, the pushback on it is getting stronger and stronger. And I think, you know, we've all done work in kind of fighting back against these censorship attempts. The ALA and GLAAD have done an incredible job to help support community members, librarians, booksellers, etc. But yes, I definitely think we're in a moment of time where these challenges are a very serious matter that we all need to be, you know, facing together.
Before we move, hold on one sec, Leah. I want to make sure that everyone who is watching, if you have questions, to make sure that you tweet your questions using the hashtag claiming our stories and tagging the Emancipator. You could also tag GLAAD, because we are watching everything. So just wanted to make sure that if you are watching, make sure you get your questions in. Okay, Leah.
You know, one of the things that I think is most important to acknowledge is that queer folks have always been here in massive numbers. And I think, you know, this is something that George and I have talked about quite a bit, is about like so often queer writers, Black writers receive our flowers for our work after we're gone, and we can't be here to revel in that and see the fruits of our labor, right? And so we're still here and we're still telling these stories. And not only that, we've done it in such a way that we've provided a generation of young people the language to talk about queerness. We've broken space for them to feel empowered enough to step into that queerness at an early age. And so that's, to me, not really a shift in demographics, it's a shift in, oh my gosh, I don't know if you all can hear my dogs in the background. That is so embarrassing. They're feeling very feisty today. We're moving, so I don't have any books on my bookshelf. And so I think they're just feeling a little, they're feeling chafed because their lives are changing so much, you know what I mean? Anyway, the point is, I don't think that this is like a huge demographic shift. I think it's a shift in power. And I think this is young people and queer people claiming power in a way that they have not felt able or capable of doing prior to this, cultural moment. And the reason why this demographic shift, to use that language, is so significant to these straight white folks in positions of power is because it is a threat to the status quo. What people want is to not ever have to let go of any of their power. That's how this works. This country is built on the backs of exploitation, right? And so if we can't exploit people's insecurities and their fears and make them feel like they must adhere to the same rules they've always adhered to, that is a threat. And the last thing people want is to have to recognize that maybe they are not in the same position they've always been in. And so there's a shift in the way we talk about these things, but not necessarily, in my view of it, not necessarily a shift in the people. There is just a different approach to the conversation on a much wider cultural level. I'm gonna mute myself because these two sassy dogs are just really going wild back here.
Harry, did you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think like Leah and Daniel have said, it does feel as much a shift in the language that we have available to define our own identities. And also I kind of feel like there's something to be said about like this idea, especially of like gender identity, and sort of set labels for sexuality is not a universal thing. It's the way that certain Western countries talk about gender, experience gender, understand gender is not a universal thing. It changes between cultures, it changes between countries and heritages, and I feel like some of that is a sense of people reclaiming some of that history and reclaiming some of that understanding, and also like it's when you get the language to understand and to define yourself. It's like with, I think it was left-handed people, wasn't it? That at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a percentage of people who identified as left-handed, and then eventually it plateaued and never sort of went that much further above it after it became like an okay thing. It seems ridiculous now, but an okay thing to be left-handed. And I wonder how much it's a similar thing, that actually once people realize that it's okay to be part of the LGBT community, whether we're going to see like a plateau, I don't know, but it sort of is an interesting sort of thing, how much the statistics are shaped by the people who are controlling those definitions.
No, that's interesting. My mother was left-handed, and she has stories about them trying to like wrap her left hand to force her to use her right hand. They didn't do it for a long time, but that's a very real thing. Like in families, I know for a fact that if they had children who were left-handed, they really tried to make them be right-handed from some like very old like superstition around left-handed people. So that's interesting. I never thought about processing it that way. It's gonna have me thinking now, like, oh, you know what? Historically, things just keep happening, and like, is that also part of what this is, right? Like you said, at some point it just was like, oh, well, left-handed people are okay, right? But then they moved on to some other battle of something else, like it always happens. Isabel, do you have any commentary on the shift in demographics?
Yeah, I mean, all of the other panelists had beautiful answers, and I just want to echo everything everyone's saying about the power dynamics and really examining, who's counting the demographics, who's keeping a tally on them. There's some obvious patterns there, and some obvious anxiety to keep control there. But I kind of wanted to just chime in about like Gen Z in general being awesome, because I have 4 younger sisters. They're all Gen Z, and they are just constantly like completely blowing my mind with the ways in which they identify, not just even in terms of sexual orientation or gender identity, but just the ways in which they are processing information rapidly all of the time and synthesizing it and taking it into themselves, and then figuring out who they are in that moment and then externalizing it. And it is this constant feedback loop that like sometimes feels very overwhelming to my millennial brain, but is overall, I just think so inspirational, and something that I just feel so lucky to have so many Gen Z kids in my life who I can constantly be talking to and asking them their opinions about these things, and asking them how they see the world, because I do think that it is, I think they are, unfortunately, because of generations before them, forced to confront just like some awful realities that are happening to them way before their time, way before they had any say. But instead of feeling very defeatist about it, they are so willing to be engaged in the long fight. And it's just something that I personally have gotten a lot out of just in my relationship with Gen Z kids, but also something as a, millennial author trying to write to maybe my own childhood trauma and my own experiences growing up. It's a reminder to not just be thinking of myself in my art, right? And being like, okay, there's some stories that all, need to get out and need to be verbalized, but maybe there are some stories that are for my journal, and some stories that are for the world as it is today, and for the kids that are coming, right? Because I'm also a TV writer, and Daniel and I wrote this book together, and those things take a year, 2 years to really come to fruition, and things change so rapidly in our world now that you do have to be thinking, I think, about the kids that are going to be encountering your work 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And so I think any sort of like structural elements that can take that into account, and in TV writing, we, especially for younger preschool age kids, we do a lot of focus group testing, a lot of research, a lot of talking to kids and their parents about what they're watching, what they want to watch, and so just talking to that generation, in addition to kind of balancing what it is that we as authors of our age wanted to see when we were kids or when we were in our 20s and teens, I think is just a really important thing to be doing at this time.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on the Gen Z love. One thing that I really love about Gen Z is they're so talkative and communicative about everything, and it's creating these wonderful conversations around things like mental health or equity. But a lot of us grew up in environments where LGBTQ topics, people is very hush hush, or almost secretive in some way. And one thing that's really exciting about all of our books is books create opportunities for conversations. So it really is like this snowball effect where you have more people who are brave enough to come out even in really difficult environments and circumstances, and that creates more of a need, more of a market for LGBTQ plus representation. And, then those books, those TV shows, whatever, become opportunities for conversation and for openness. And I think, one thing that's really exciting is, kids thinking about, kids reading one of my picture books or Harry's or, Isabel's, and having that conversation with their parent at a young age, where their parent is giving them affirmations about, queer identities and queer relationships in a way that for a lot of people that's never been talked about before.
Love all of that. Love all of that. Well, it's interesting because, I've done a lot of events about this book banning and about all of it. I feel like the face that pops up a lot when we talk about books and book banning. And so I'm saying this to say that means it comes with being a target at many times. And even when we do these type of things, we never are able to even do these type of things without like a lot of hateful comments. I've been called a pedophile, I've been called a groomer, I've been called all of these things. And the reality of this issue, or what many think this issue is that what we are trying to do is trample upon parental rights. That me writing this book and saying I want to give this book to a 14 to 18-year-old, because we're going to make sure that we also clarify that many of these books are being written in the age-appropriate categories that we are writing them for. That you have no right to write this book and give this to my child. But reality, we are not trying to take away parental rights. We are trying to provide books and tools and resources for those who need it the most. What are you all's feelings around this quote unquote being a parental right issue? Is this a issue of where we are delving into taking away parental rights, or is this actually an issue of certain parental rights are being stripped from certain parents who do want their students to have a more diverse vocabulary and diverse reading selection? Anyone can take this.
This is one of my favorite questions.
You go, Leah.
I was about to say, Harry, just let me do this real quick, and then I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna shut up. Listen, I don't give a fuck about these parents, okay? The reality is, the problem with writing for children is that so often you're faced with adults who don't think of children as human beings with thoughts and feelings and agency. And the reality is, when I was 14, 15, I knew a lot more about my own inner life than anybody could have imagined, right? And so if I had been provided with a text that could have given me more insights into what I was reckoning with, then it wouldn't have taken 10 years of therapy for me to become the person I am today. You know what I mean? So the issue with parental rights is like not so much about I as a parent reserve the right to control what my child has access to. Really, to me, it should be a question of why don't we give children the right that we would give any human being to read and think and be considerate and thoughtful? If all of us are on the same page about the capabilities of Gen Z, right? Every single one of us believes that these are tenacious, brilliant, fierce kids, right? If we believe that about them, if we really do, then why don't we trust them to make decisions about what they can and cannot consume safely? Like, I think that the conversation about like what as a parent you have the right to control is just like, I don't know. I think it's actually not so much about them and not wanting them to let kids read what they want to read, and is more about, well, why don't these parents think of their kids as human beings?
I want to chime in on this because this is a wolf in sheep's clothes. This has nothing to do with parental rights. That we are even using their language drives me crazy, because this is language that they've created in order to make it feel like we are trying to influence children in a bad way, when this is about storytelling, and this is about this, I'm a parent and I have rights too, it turns out. So my children can't see or read Heather and her two moms. So whose parental rights are we talking about? I'd like to know. And second to that, I just want to be really clear that this does not have anything to do, and I think, George, you used this word earlier, about appropriate and inappropriate materials. This has to do with framing a concerted effort against a marginalized community and doing it in a way that is palpable to most Americans, that feels like, of course, everyone's for parental rights. You should be able to raise your child the way that you should want to raise your child, that they should be exposed. I want to make sure that my kids are at gay pride parades. That's important to me. And I think it's if they want to go, and that's their choice. But I also think that we're falling into their trap by using their language and giving it even more air.
Anyone else have any thoughts around that question?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with everything that Sarah's just said. It feels like we're playing into a game that they have already kind of rigged against us, because it's appealing to an emotional state rather than a factual reality. I mean, let's think about the number of people who are involved in making a book. I mean, we've got, we're the authors, we've got editors, we've got publicists, we've got art directors and designers and marketing and the booksellers who are selling the books, the librarians who are, I mean, all of those people, all these people are going to have families, all these people are going to have parents and kids. And is it really a question of parental rights, or is it just a question of we have this group of people and certain people don't want them to exist, essentially? And that kind of is what it boils down to. It's just trying to sort of legislate us out of spaces that we can and should exist. And I mean, on the point, like the age appropriate kind of thing, like, we're professionals, we know what is appropriate for the age groups we are writing for, the age groups that we're publishing for. So I kind of think, like, we just need to keep on doing what we're doing and try not to play into this sort of emotional arena, because it is the sort of thing that kind of gets rigged against you.
Just to really quickly add on to this, to Harry's point, like when we're talking about the language of what is and is not appropriate, the first time that my book was challenged, it was in Oklahoma, and it was challenged by the Attorney General's office under the guise of indecency. It was challenged for being indecent. There's nothing indecent in my book. I wasn't even allowed to curse in my book because they wanted to put it in the Scholastic Book Fair, and they were like, Leah, if you want in the book fair, drop the F-bombs, get them out of here. And so, I made a lot of concessions to make sure that this book was as appropriate and as palatable as possible, right? And this idea of the book being indecent isn't about the content itself. It's about the fact that it's a queer book written by an openly queer person. And so, Kyle Lukoff, an author that I love so much and admire so much, wrote an essay recently for Booklist, I think, where it just spoke so brilliantly to the present moment we're in, which is that, like, a threat or a challenge against queer books is actually a challenge against queer folks existing publicly. That's what they want to take away. It's not about the books. It's not about the rights of the parents. It's not really even about the kids. It's about the fact that if they can, they want to make it so that we don't exist in public. And so they want to shame us. They want to shame our stories. They want to shame the work that we have done. And at the core of this entire conversation is that they hate queer people. they are threatened by queer people, and they will do anything they can to make us seem like we are villains in this narrative, when in fact all we've done is exist and do jobs.
I think it's also important to kind of point out that when we say appropriate, we're talking about developmentally appropriate. And I think when, you know, some of these attacks are talking about appropriateness, it becomes a moral judgment, for example, which is not really what libraries, booksellers are supposed to be doing. I think, you know, the purpose of libraries, and there's a library bill of rights in the United States, kind of managed by the ALA, but these are supposed to be opportunities for communities to come get information freely. And, you know, I think one of the other problems that we are also facing is sort of self-censorship by librarians and booksellers when they become afraid to put our stuff, put our books on their shelves because they are concerned about getting challenges. And I think that's something that we also need to be talking about beyond just the actual challenges and banning attempts that we're seeing.
Yeah, I do want to add to that though, because I do work with a lot of librarians, that one of the main sticking points that I will always say publicly is for them to choose their safety over my book, especially because in Texas, they literally took away the entire ebook library because the librarian would not take away my book. She refused to take away my book, and so they defunded the entire ebook library. And so I do want to also put out there that it's nuanced, because it has become dangerous, because there is a violent aspect to it, as a librarian's home in Texas was shot into after she did a gay book fair, for a free book fair for students. So you know, it's very layered, very nuanced. We probably could talk about it all day. Isabel, did you have any thing to add? Because I do want to make sure we at least get to one or two of the audience questions before we go.
Everyone else, I think, covered this topic beautifully.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. So we have a couple of audience questions. One from Lana Leonard, which is, do you think about the future of queer storytelling? And if so, what does it look like? Well, I think it looks black, and it looks big, and it looks bold, and it looks amazing. I also know that it's going to look like fiction stories and romantic comedies. And I also know it is going to look like us going back into the past and retelling stories that were told improperly about our people, and us being the ones to get to finally tell the stories about our people. If you think that these book bans are going to stop us, we have another trick for everybody. They are only empowering us to write more books, and we in turn are only empowering other queer authors to take their shot at writing their own books. So I think that the future of queer storytelling, I think we're just beginning. We're just scraping the surface.
You know, I agree with you, George. You know, I agree with you. I mean, look, the reality is we've always been here. We've always done the work. The question is, were we being elevated? Were we being given platforms? Were we being traditionally published? Were we being paid a living wage so that we could continue to write books? Like, these are the real questions. And so I think the future of queer storytelling is going to be even bigger. It's going to be even bolder. I believe that this is a blip on the radar of the work that we have done and will continue to do. I think the stories we're going to tell in the future are going to exist at the intersections of more identities than we've seen elevated so far. I mean, you know, when I wrote You Should See Me in a Crown, we didn't have comp titles for my book. There weren't other Black queer girl rom-coms that had been, you know, incredibly commercially successful that we could point to and be like, hey, you should invest in this book and this story and this storyteller, because look, people care. We didn't know if people cared. I mean, I knew, but there were no numbers to back that up, right? And so I think the more books we write, the more successful we are, the more space that is created for people to come up after us. I don't want to pull up a seat at the table. I want us to flip the fucking table. I'm tired of the table. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't want to leave the door open. I want the door off the hinges. And so I think we're right there. I feel a shift coming, and I know that it's coming because people are only ever this angry when something really, really good is about to happen. And so I'm excited to be a part of it, and I'm excited to see who comes next.
Yes.
Yeah, George, I just want to thank you first for clarifying, of course, safety over anything. And I'm not putting the onus on individual librarians, as amazing of the work that they do. I think that's, the job of us, our community, our allies, to make sure that they're able to put our books on their shelves and feel comfortable doing so. In response to your question, I think the answer for me is just more and more diverse, like more queer stories, different types of queer stories, different formats, everything. I'm super excited to see, in the next 10 years. I just think about 10 years ago and where we are now, and it's super exciting.
So we do have another question from the audience, from fellow author Curtis Chen. I'm coming out with my gay memoir in 2023, and I'm worried about it being banned. How do you emotionally handle this threat? Well, Curtis, as the person with the banned memoir, how do you handle this? I mean, there's no way that you can emotionally be prepared for it. You never know what it's going to end up looking like. One thing I will say is my grandmother always said you can't worry and pray. So don't worry, pray. And just know that when they are banning memoirs, like, they're banning your true story, right? That means that your true story is powerful. I wouldn't even be worried about it. Like in reality, it being banned should be on the least of your worries, right? Because what's going to happen is you're going to see the messages from the people that it's helping, and it's going to outweigh every single time I get to like a place. I promise you, I get a direct message from some teenager or someone, and they blow my mind about what the book did for them, and I put my armor back on and I go back out to battle these people. So just know that if you get banned, it is a great place to be, because that is the only list I'm on with Toni Morrison. So be proud and wear banning as a badge of honor. Don't be worried about your book getting banned, and we're gonna make sure we all buy it and share it. Now we do have one final question from Gail Massey. How has the publishing industry changed or is changing to be more inclusive? Anyone could jump in real quick.
Let me say this. Now, look, selling books is very difficult. And I don't mean like selling copies of books, which is also difficult. I mean selling books to publishers, getting somebody to say, yes, this is worthwhile. We'll take this on and we'll put it on a shelf, right? Like, that has not changed. And it is more difficult for Black folks. It's more difficult for, people in color in general, but I can speak as a Black person. It's more difficult for disabled people. It's more difficult for people who are not, they don't adhere to this like westernized white supremacist idea of like what beauty is, because we even know that affects people selling books at this point. And so it's still incredibly challenging to sell books, and I don't want to undercut that. But I will say that there have been so many moments where it seemed impossible for me to do a thing. It seemed impossible for me to get, on a bestseller list or to win a Stonewall or like to do any of these things, because there weren't like a lot of examples of that before. But all it takes is one. What's that thing Lady Gaga was saying on tour for that The Star Is Born? She's like, in a room full of 99 no's, all it takes is one yes. We've got those one yeses. And so that's what it took. And all we needed was that one yes. And then, we can look behind us now and see like, oh, there are 5 books coming out that in their announcement use the title of my book. You know what I mean? Like, that's a hypothetical number. I'm not counting announcements. That would be a crazy thing to do. But, if I did do that, then you could see that like we're doing more and seeing more than ever before. That doesn't undercut the challenge. It's not to say that it's not still very difficult, but it is to say that like, I don't have to count Black queer rom-coms on one hand anymore. Like, there's a whole section for them at Barnes & Noble. So we're doing something. We got a little something.
Does anyone want to give a final word before we close this wonderful session out, or just, yeah, this has been great.
I'll just say that, one of the things that is seeing some of these banning attempts happen that's been really exciting to me is in most of the cases, it's, one random parent. And then in response, you see the community really come together. And I think that's, I want to, whenever I hear about a banning attempt, I want to give as much support that I can to that community. But it is really about that community and seeing groups of parents and other adults, other community members coming together and pushing back on those banning attempts. That's what gets me really excited, because you're just thinking about those kids in that community who are seeing adults in their life saying like, no, this is not okay to be banning these types of books, and these identities and these relationships are okay.
And I'll add to that, but in my kids' class a few days ago, they ride their bikes sometimes to school, and one of the little girls, Greer, had a t-shirt on that said "Read banned books."
Exactly.
I was like, I need that. 13. That's a 13-year-old. So our future is looking bright.
All right. Well, I want to thank each author. Definitely want to thank Sarah Kate Ellis from GLAAD. We know your schedule is always probably busier than mine, child. So I'm glad you were able to make a Zoom this evening. But to all the authors, because as someone who's a writer, I know all of y'all's schedules are busy, and I'm so grateful that you all came this evening to share your experiences, to share your words. Once again, just want to make sure everybody knows these authors' names: Isabel Galupo, Daniel Haack, Leah Johnson, Harry Woodgate. Also want to thank the GLAAD team for helping coordinate this amazing event. Thank the Emancipator, the Banned Books Week team. And finally, we want to make sure that we thank our audience for everyone who is out there and supporting us, and making sure that we are loved on, and making sure that the words of our books and titles are not being misconstrued. We truly appreciate it. Continue to buy banned books. And I'm also going to say to those who may be against us, I know that you all would hate to only be judged by a very slim portion of something in your life. So when you take a paragraph out of our books and judge our entire worth of our books on that, you are doing the exact same thing. So I would actually encourage you to actually read the entire book before you make any public statements about what our books are about, because you truly cannot judge a book by its cover. So please let us know your feedback. Keep the conversation going. Follow along on @TheEmancipator for more incredible events and compelling content. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.